everybody to the last of a series of webinars called Your Standards, Your Say. My name is Carolyn Young. I'm the Executive Director of the Organic Council of Ontario. And we've been hosting these webinars to give people a chance to better understand what the changes are to the organic standards as we go through the review process. And we're now in the sort of last stages of the review process for the 2020 standard. And we've assembled a group of experts who have participated in the working groups and the reviews and the changes to give us a bit of a summary and overview of what exactly has changed and how. So just go to the next slide. Oops, sorry. So I just want to make sure everybody understands we're working with Zoom here, and you should have received a support number in your email. But at any time, if you're having trouble hearing or you want to send in a comment or question, there's something called the chat function you should have in your tools, and there's a little icon here. You can send a chat to everyone or just to me, just to let us know if you have a question or comment or any problems. And I wanted to remind everybody that we are recording the call, so any comments you make will be recorded. And we're hoping to publicly share this webinar. We will be sharing it first with participants and then more publicly. So thank you very much for joining. And I apologize if I'm a little bit distracted because I'm admitting people as we speak. So on our agenda, we'll start with an introduction and welcome. That's me. And then Hugh Martin is here to speak a little bit to the overview of the standards review process. He's the chair of the technical committee, And we have OCO board member Rob Walbridge here to speak on updates on the crops area and parallel production. Joel Aitken, another OCO board member, who will speak to livestock updates and issues, ruminants, pork and poultry specifically. Norm Hansen is here from Earview Acres, and he's also on the OCO board and has a kind of an overview of what's happened with greenhouse and container issues. Rochelle Eisen should be joining us shortly from BC. She's a long-time organic inspector and expert, and we'll talk about sprout shoots and microgreens, and then later on about preparation updates. Simon's going to speak to the permitted substances list, specifically on crops, and maybe a little bit on livestock as well. We weren't able to get Francois Labelle to join us to speak to livestock input, so Simon might answer questions on that. And then finally, Nicole Boudreau from the Organic Federation of Canada will talk about the next steps in the review process. We'll have about 20 minutes for question and answer, and then we're hoping to close at about 1:40. So thank you again all for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over. Now I'll just quickly say a few words about the review process, and then I'll hand it over to Hugh. But essentially, as you all know, the standards are, the organic standards are written into law under the standards, the Safe Food for Canadians regulations. And the Safe Food for Canadians regulations refer to the standards. So our standards are not in regulation, they're a separate standard, and they adhere to the International Standards Organization's ISO guidelines. But because of the fact that they are not in regulation, they're considered industry standards, which is allows the Canadian organic sector to have input into how those standards change and are updated. And they have to be updated on every 5 years in order to stay relevant. And they're managed, or they're held by the General Standards Board. So the standards obviously have an impact on the industry, and I'm glad that everybody is involved in that, compared to the United States, where government does have the final say on the standards. We have a very democratic system here. However, we also do have to pay for our standards at the moment, and that's something that we're working to change. So, Hugh, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Carolyn. And I must apologize, my video doesn't seem to be working today, so none of you can look at my beautiful face. But at any rate, we'll quickly go through the process here. And as Carolyn has just mentioned, the Standards Council of Canada, Canadian General Standards Board, who oversee the writing of the standards, they require us to revise the Canadian Organic Standard every 5 years. So we started that process for what we referred to as our 2020 revision about a year ago, a little over a year ago. And over the winter we had, I've got here 80 plus, it's probably 90 plus conference calls and 4 conference call meetings, plus 2.5 days of in-person meetings in Ottawa last April, I think it was. We started out with about 220 comments that the public and other people had submitted in as comments. They wanted to change to the standards, or they wanted something looked at in some way. And about 20% of those we looked at and said, no, we think we're good where we're at. We don't need to make a change here, whatever. But that still left us with probably 175 changes, and some of those changes are minor. Some of them are fairly significant. And as you go through the draft revised standard that came out on July 2nd, you'll see on the track change copies where we have made additions or deletions, or in some cases, you'll see both on the same page as a comment is struck out and moved somewhere. So you got to be a little careful as to looking at that, but that basically is the way it is set up. We've had a 90-day public comment period. That's going to end in a couple weeks. And those comments will then be reviewed by the working group chairs and by the working groups when necessary, to see if the revisions that we have suggested are still good, or maybe there's something that we haven't thought of that a commenter will put in. So these are draft, they're not final version yet. There may be some things that won't go forward because of the comments, but I certainly, based on history, would expect that almost all of them will go through. But there may be some tweaks to them. There may be, some of them be editorial, some will be translation, of course, and some of them may have a word added or something like that. The revised standard, whenever we're done with it later this fall, will then go for approval by CGSB and by the Standards Council of Canada to be approved as a national standard of Canada. That will hopefully be published about November of 2020, if it's in accordance with the 2015 standard, which was published in late November. And then in 2021, operators will be required to come into compliance with the new standard. So none of this is going to affect anybody for next year, really. But by 2021, everybody will be expected to come on board and come into compliance with the new standard. So those are my comments. Carolyn, I'm not sure how you're doing questions, but yeah, proceed.
We're gonna wait until the end for questions. Okay, yep. Thanks. So now let's have Rob Walbridge to talk about crops and parallel production.
Sure. Thanks, Carolyn. So yeah, there were a number of issues discussed at the crops working group, and the major changes I wanted to highlight were parallel production and seeds, and how we deal with the various things that can be added to seed, or the processes that seed undergoes. There were other things like manure sourcing that were discussed during the process, but that there were no changes made there. So parallel production was probably the most controversial. There were a lot of strong arguments on both sides of the issue. People who wanted to open parallel production up entirely, and others who wanted to maintain the prohibition as it stood in the previous version of the standard. And so what we came to in the end was kind of a compromise revision that's being proposed here, and you can see it on your screens. there was an editorial change from enterprise to operation just to make wording consistent through the standard. And then we added in the clause that will allow annual crops harvested during the final 24 months of the transition period when fields are added to existing operations. So that basically allows organic farmers who are expanding or bringing on new fields are able to do so without having to disrupt the crop rotation or add an entirely different crop to their farm just in order to keep remain in compliance or set up a second company or something like that in order to expand using land that hasn't gone through the complete 36 months yet. And then at the same time, we clarified the definition on visual distinguishability. Do you want to flip forward to the next screen, please? So the definition on parallel production was updated to more closely define what visually distinguishable or visually indistinguishable varieties are, to clarify that visually indistinguishable means that a common person looking at crops positioned side by side would not be able to tell a difference. So probably the most common example I can think of would be soybeans, where if you have a dark hilum soybean versus a clear hilum or a yellow hilum soybean, those are quite obvious to the average person. One has dark spots on it and the other doesn't. So those would be considered visually distinguishable crops. Something like wheat, where you have a hard red wheat or a soft red wheat, a plant breeder or a grain grader would be able to tell the difference between those two crops, but the common person would not. So in that case, those two crops would not be considered eligible to be produced in parallel. And do you want to move ahead, Kellen? So there was also some discussion about changing the wording on 5.1.3 in terms of encouraging complete transition of the production, but in the end we left it. There were, and as well, any of the special conditions pertaining to parallel production remained the same. For seed sources, again, there was a lot of discussion around, well, how do we deal with treated, primed, pelleted, or coated seeds? When the standard was originally written, there weren't near as many options available for seed, especially in the greenhouse sector and with vegetable seeds. In recent years, there've just been a plethora of different materials and techniques used to prime, pellet, or coat seeds. So we felt that there had to be more clarification around that. So you can see there where they added in extra wording around treating, priming, and pelleting. And if you want to flip forward, Carolyn, you can see how we also deal with non-organic sources. Again, we had to remove the untreated wording because there are allowable seed treatments. And as well, added a clause at the end there to allow seeds that are treated for substances necessary for compliance to international, federal, or provincial phytosanitary or food safety regulations and approved for use by regulatory agencies such as PMRA. And again, that just would mostly pertain to something like the horticultural or greenhouse sector. And I think I've got one more. And so again, there were a number of definitions added to the standard in order to clarify what's meant by each of these different terms. So seed coating is something that coats the seed, but not necessarily increases the size of the seed. Seed pelleting is what we refer to when we're talking about something that's increasing the size of the seed to facilitate seeding. Again, seed priming is something that allows basically speeds up the rate of germination and improves the uniformity of germination. And then the seed treatment, again, is something that's added to the seed for a specific purpose in terms of performance in the field. I think that pretty much covers changes to the crop section.
Yes. Joel, are you ready to speak?
Yes, I am.
Great.
Hear me well?
It's a little bit faint, but it's okay, I think.
Let's go a little bit closer here.
Please.
All right. So yeah, we can go to the first slide there. I started off with all of the major changes that apply to all different species of livestock. So the first one here is we completely rewrote the section around drinking water requirements. So the previous requirement was a little bit confusing as to what kind of water analysis was required and what kind of annual sampling, etc., would be required for different types of livestock. So it has been rewritten to 6.4.5 here above. So all livestock of all ages shall have access to clean, fresh water on demand. Livestock water sources shall be tested according to livestock drinking water quality guidelines and procedures outlined in the relevant code of practice and quality assurance programs mandated by industry associations. So basically, rather than trying to rewrite the book on what water requirements are, we referred out to the specific industries that have already done in their codes of practice. Generally, water testing sections in those are recommended. And so we're basically saying that we're going to verify that recommended water sampling is actually completed by the organic operations. And then the next section here is becoming, oh no, we're still on that first slide there, yep. Is allowances for use of non-organic feed during feed shortages. So basically, we have created a hierarchy of forage sources that livestock operators can go to get additional forage in times of emergency need, when their organic supply of forage has run out or is strictly limited due to climatic conditions or whatever. And so the first priority of sources for that non-organic forage are non-organic forages from land in transition into organic. The second one is then non-organic forages grown without the use of prohibited substances. So that could be from a buffer area around an organic crop that has been grown without a prohibited substance, but can't be marketed, or that couldn't be normally used as organic because it's in the buffer area. Or it could be a declaration from a neighbor or whatever that says that they haven't used any prohibited substances on that crop. Then the third one here is non-organic forages without prohibited substances in the last 60 days prior to harvest. So if you can't find a substance that hasn't had any on it for the full year, then you can go to something that hasn't in the last 60 days. And then the last one is if you can't find any of those above sources, then you can go to non-organic forage, any non-organic forage, as long as it's not a genetically engineered crop. And then in addition to that, we've added the requirement that operators produce a contingency plan as to how they're going to manage situations in the future to reduce the chances that they may need to use non-organic forages during a shortage, in a future shortage. So how are they going to adapt their system to prevent the requirement to feed non-organic feed in the future? Go to the next there, yep. So the next one that applies to all different types of livestock is, I think, an important but somewhat subtle change to the requirements for outdoor exercise areas. So we included the words construction and management of outdoor exercise areas to encourage use, to encourage appropriate use year-round by the livestock. So previously, outdoor runs needed to be managed in a way to prevent soil degradation. Now the intent is that you create a system, create an outdoor exercise area that can be used for as much of the season as is appropriate for that type of livestock, and that isn't prone to flooding or conditions that would then cause environmental degradation of the vegetation or the soil or runoff into water sources, etc. That there really be some long-term planning into how can we get these animals outside as much as we can without negatively impacting the animals or the environment. Then the allowances for restriction of outdoor access in emergency situations or in for climatic conditions or whatever have not changed. There's still the same allowances for livestock to be kept indoors. The only addition that we've made to the end of that is that the operator needs to document measures taken to reduce the need to restrict outdoor access in the future if that's due to circumstances that are under the operator's control. So if it seems like an operation is restricting outdoor access more than other operations or for reasons that are within their own control, they need to move towards a system that will reduce that need in the future. The stocking density tables have all been updated. Generally, it's just to clarify more specific groups or specific housing types. So in the dairy, so for ruminants, it was all one big table. Now we've split out dairy operations and beef operations, and the dairy operations are more specific to the different types of housing housing styles, and therefore the size of area that's required in each of those different housing styles. For beef, it's more clear as to the different age or weight brackets of livestock and how much area is required for each of those. I would say that the most significant kind of change in terms of the actual physical area required per animal is actually in sheep and goats. So those have been updated. Again, those have been based mostly off of the industry codes of practice. And then there is also some allowances in there for poultry and swine if the stocking density of a given flock or a group of animals surpasses the stocking density of the barn because say they were expecting a certain mortality rate, but that didn't happen and more animals survived to full market weight than they thought they were going to, and then all of a sudden they're over their stocking density, or they grew faster than they thought they were going to, and therefore they got heavier, like more kilos per square foot than was allowed in the standard, we're not going to automatically downgrade those animals because they did too well. But there is a requirement that there be a plan to reduce those chances of that happening in the future as well. So we'll move to the next slide here. Keep going. Livestock healthcare. The biggest change in this one again as well is parasite management. If you look at the track changes version of this one, there is a lot of changes to kind of clarify things. We've added a fairly significant section in there around disinfection methods that shall be practiced, including barns, downtime for barns. So time when the barns don't have any livestock in them to reduce that parasite load. The observation of livestock, including the assessment of tissue at slaughter to indicate the potential infection of parasites. We got some very strong feedback from the pork industry specifically that that's the fastest way for them to find infections before they show up in other results. Again, control plans to avoid similar emergencies in the future, and written instructions from veterinarians as to the specific method and product to be used in order to prevent resistance of parasites. Again, everything is about prevention first, but then quick and efficient and effective treatment as quickly as possible to prevent the spread and to prevent the buildup of parasitic loads and get back to that preventative state. So we'll move to the next slide. In dairy, there's an allowance now for calves to be fed milk from organic cows that have received treatment with antibiotics if a withholding period of at least twice the label requirement, or 14 days, whichever is longer, is applied. So that milk can still not go into the organic supply stream for sale as organic milk into the bulk tank. But some of that milk that was being dumped up until now will now be able to be fed to organic calves. So we're putting all this effort through to get these, to make this milk. Why should we be dumping it down the drain? Once we know that antibiotic has been cleared from the system, then that can go into calves before it can go back into the organic milk stream. Then we have requirements for dairy cattle housing. So tie stalls will be phased out of organic production by 2030, and electric trainers are prohibited in tie stalls as of November 2020. So that is already in the current standard. We just made it very clear in the current standard that is in fact the case, and that November 2020 is still the date for electric trainers to be out, and that tie stall production by November 2020, tie stall operations, basically even if major renovations are required, that needs to happen by 2030 to get rid of tie stalls. We'll move to the next. All right, so poultry, the addition of the rewording of the requirement for protection in the outdoor areas of poultry. So now there is a specific requirement for overhead cover to provide shade and protection from aviary predators. They can be of many different forms, and we need a plan submitted by the operator to ensure that at least 10% of the range by 20 by 2023, we need to know that by 2025, 10% of the range area will be covered with overhead cover. And there are some options as to how producers would do that. There's now also a requirement for winter gardens to be used when layers do not have access to outdoor runs because of weather or disease constraints. So if birds aren't getting full access out onto range, they at least need to have access out of the barn into winter garden areas, which are partially protected from the climate, but are still open air and kind of a transition area out into range. And there's quite a few allowances below that for what the requirements are for winter gardens, existing winter gardens being kind of grandfathered into the program. So we want to incentivize or allow existing operations to use the infrastructure that they've invested in already, and require that operations that are not providing the required outdoor access, or that are not meeting the expectations for outdoor access at this time, invest in putting in winter gardens that will encourage that outdoor access moving forward. Barn raised meat chickens, so broiler birds, as had previously been in the standard, require outdoor access on a daily basis by at least 25 days of age. Now we're putting in some requirements to demonstrate that a minimum of 15% of the birds are on the range when there are no weather constraints. And if an operator is not able to achieve that above outdoor access requirement, some form of action shall be taken over the annual production cycle to increase the probability of birds using that outdoor access during their lifetime. So we understand that broiler flocks are a short, fast cycle, but we need to show that there is some action being taken by producers to get up to that 15% of birds actually getting outside. Go to the next. Moving on into swine, pig outdoor access areas. There's a bunch of additions in here. Basically, if they are being provided pasture, which isn't required, if they for some reason need to be held off of that pasture because the pasture is being degraded and we don't want to cause soil and water degradation, they need to have some other form of outdoor exercise area so that they're still getting that outdoor access. When outdoors in open areas like pasture, pigs need to have access to shade and shelter, as with other outdoor animals. Pigs cannot be exclusively confined to outdoor concrete yards. Basically, we don't want pens of pigs on concrete outside. They either need to have some sort of bedding material over that concrete, or scratching, like somewhere where they can dig, or the ability to get back inside into a bedded area. Yeah. So significant changes in there, but yeah, we'll move on. Also in swine, so specifically for parasites, swine breeding stock have an additional allowance to receive up to 3 treatments of parasiticide in a given year if they are in the process of trying to clear a parasite load out of the system. Like they have a high parasite level and they want to clear that out of their barn. They can do up to 3 treatments in those circumstances, whereas all other animals are restricted to 2. So that additional 1 should get us to the point where we can clean out some barns and get them back to a prevention rather than a continual treatment situation. In case of catastrophic events such as barn fires, etc., this is actually applicable to all livestock except poultry. there is an allowance to repopulate barns with non-organic breeding stock if organic breeding stock is not available. So again, if an outbreak of a disease or whatever were to cause a barn to have to be emptied, and it's impossible for them to refill that with organic breeding stock from available suppliers, they can do that from non-organic breeding stock as an exception. We can move forward again. That might be the end of mine, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Thanks, Joel. Please hold your questions till the end, and then we're going to be moving on to Norm Hansen. Just wanted to let everybody know I have been going through the registration list, and I think that everybody is covered. But if you do have a chance to write your full name in, that helps with our attendance list. Thanks so much. Bye. So,
Okay,
Norm.
I'm going to go over the changes in the greenhouse and container working group. Next slide, please. The changes were pretty extensive in this area. In wording, the actual intent of the soil changes is basically maintained to what it was before, just a little bit more detail added. The lighting changes were extra. They were something that was added. And then the other changes, again, really don't change anything. They just kind of move things around and make things clearer in terms of the wording. I'm not going to go through all the detail that was in the previous slides. I'm just going to provide a summary. And so if you want to follow along with the detail, you can follow along. Hopefully some of you have it open, the changes document or the final version that was on the OCO website. Next slide, please. So in the soil section, it's completely reworded and renumbered, but there's really no major concept changes. There are a lot of changes, and those changes revolve more around being a little more specific in what we're saying. Before, we said that hydroponic and aeroponic production is prohibited, and we've maintained that wording, and we've actually moved that up to the beginning of the soil section, because everything else in the soil section basically revolves around that, is that we want to, as it says in the iPhone principles, we want to feed the life in the soil and have the life in the soil feed the crop. And that always happens in field production. In greenhouse production, we have to specify that. The way it read before was soil used in a container system, with the exception of transplant plants, shall provide nutrients to plants continuously. The soil, in brackets growth media, shall contain a mineral fraction and an organic fraction. It shall support life and ecosystem diversity. So that was just kind of a general statement saying what we want to do, which is feed the life in the soil, and the soil of the life feeds the plants. The problem was the certifiers possibly would have a problem auditing that, because it wasn't super specific in terms of what was needed. Different people could interpret that different ways, and it was just kind of something that would be waiting for a lot of questions to the Standards Interpretation Committee. And so what we did was we kind of put some minimum levels in on a more specific basis. Again, these are minimum levels. You should probably go quite a bit beyond them, but if we go this far to a minimum level, it kind of gives everybody the idea of what the best thing to do to get a good result out of growing organic in a media that you make yourself, rather than in the earth. So we organized it under hydroponic and aeroponic productions are prohibited. We talked about diversity, and so we maintain the specification on 10% compost, and we added a specification on at least 2% minerals. Before it just said some mineral content, and so now we're saying that's at least 2%. And again, probably in order to provide that ecosystem for lots of different soil life, some diversity, probably you should go well beyond that 2%. We had the volume requirements for greenhouses before at 60 liters per meter squared. We've taken that and made that a volume requirement for all crops. And we've done this by saying that for slow growing crops, it's 1 liter per week of production time. So therefore a 60 week slow growing crop would need 60 liters per meter squared. And then for faster growing crops, it's 2 liters per meter squared per week of growing time. So therefore for a faster growing crop, if you had a 30-week crop, you'd need that 60 liters per meter squared, the same as we do in greenhouse crops. The state greenhouse crop section was updated. Really nothing was changed, just some things were moved out into other areas, and some rewording took place to make things more clear. And then the note was updated. So we changed from the old organic regulations to the new Safe Foods for Canadians. And so we made that change, and we also added the 2 different possibilities is 12 weeks of scrutiny by a certifier if you're growing not in the soil, so in a container, and in a greenhouse, if you are growing in soil, then it's 15 months. Sorry, 12 months and 15 months that you have to be under the scrutiny of a certifier before you can market your crop. Next section. Next slide. So this is the lighting section. This is what was added. So this is completely new. Before it said supplemental lighting is allowed. Now we've made an allowance for 100% artificial light. And so in new section 7.5.4, we state that sunlight is still preferred. And if a crop is greater than 60 days, then sunlight is required. But if it's less than 60 days, then artificial light is allowed. So 100% artificial light. So in a growth chamber or multiple layer production systems, that type of thing. And then we've also added another section 7.5.9, which adds restrictions when it's 100% artificial, is that CO2 can only come from biological sources, so fermentation or things like that. That transpiration water has to be reused, so rather than just opening the vents to get rid of humidity, you would have to somehow condense that water and reuse that water. And that drain water must be reused or treated. So that's kind of the same requirement all greenhouses have, is with the new MOE, we can't just dump our drain water, but we still do have the option in a greenhouse to just dump the drain water into a sewer. If you were growing with 100% artificial light, you wouldn't be able to do that. You would still have to reuse it or treat it. Next slide. And then other clarifications or changes. So then all through the rest of the section, some things were just basically made clearer or reorganized. We changed the title from greenhouse to protected crops and containers. This made it clear that somebody who wasn't growing in a greenhouse, possibly in some kind of a shade structure or something like that, might want to use this system. Also, say somebody was growing out of the soil in a field, nursery crops or something like that, they would then be growing in containers, and parts of this section would also be applicable. We added, this is an addition, not just a change of what was there before. If a crop is less than 30 days, you must use organic seed. And so there's no provision for using non-organic seed if organic seed is not available. And that's just was to be consistent with the section that Rochelle's going to be talking about, the sprouts and microgreens. They made that change, and so we made that change just to be consistent with them. Before it said CO2 from compressed sources is allowed, and so that would be presumably CO2 from all sources that could be compressed. And so we just made it clear that CO2 from all sources is allowed. This was specifically to make sure that we were allowing CO2 from cogen and from trigen, and that was allowed because that's a good environmentally sustainable way to produce CO2. And then the whole section on cultural and sanitation practices was over the years kind of all over the place. And so without making any changes, we reorganized that to make it clearer and more to the point. And that's it.
Thanks, Norm. Rochelle, are you available?
I am available. Good morning, Caroline. My video doesn't work, but my mic should be working, hopefully.
Yes, it's good.
Okay, great. So I'm talking about sprout shoots and microgreens as hinted by Norm. So let's move on to the next slide, please, Caroline. This section was also completely reorganized. So it's more logical because it was sort of divided up and hard to navigate. Up front, it states artificial lighting is allowed for sprout shoots and microgreens. Just to correct Norm, organic seeds were always required in sprout shoots and microgreens. And this section's always been related to crops less than 30 days. It's just the greenhouse section didn't state organic seeds were required for crops for less than 30 days. So therefore, we just aligned the two sections so people wouldn't be thinking that they could use non-organic seeds for crops less than 30 days if they just read the greenhouse section. So those two sections now align on the seed thing. The other thing that got changed or clarified was based on an SIC standards interpretation question. It was about the containers, the growing containers. Again, this whole idea about the shoots, sprouts, and microgreens is if they're in water, there should be no nutrient supply to the crop. And so now we're talking about the containers because one of the questions that the Standards Interpretation Committee got was, can we use burlap? Can we use coir to grow sprouts? And I think that was the question. And so this is why there's now a container section making it very clear that if you're growing the crop in water, you must be using an inert container. There cannot be any nutrient contribution to the crop if it's in water. And we also made it very clear that untreated plant materials, so if you're using coir, peat, whatever, burlap seems to be a big thing that people are experimenting on because they can roll it up and move it in and they can fill greenhouse shelves and shelves with it easily. So as long as it's untreated, it can be used as long as there's a soil system. So you can't just have that burlap floating in water and produce the product. It would have to be in contact with the container soil. And to duplicate the greenhouse section, we made the clarification about requiring a mineral and organic fraction in the soil mixes being used for sprout shoots and microgreens. Caroline, can you move to the next slide? The other thing for sprout shoots and microgreens is we added more language about what's covered under the section. So it turns out, like as I said, crops harvested within 30 days. Okay, so that's not a change from previous, but we added some extra jargon that we're seeing out in the market to help people understand which section of the standard they should be reading. So we added the word nano shoots because that seems to be a new marketing term, and also living greens. So living greens harvested within 30 days must comply with 7.4. They can't use the greenhouse or protected crop section, protected structure section. And we also added in a clause that made it very clear that if you're growing little mini heads or something, that's not shoot sprouts microgreens, that's greenhouse. So we're just trying to make it clear all the time on what sections are pertinent. The other major change is in the sprout shoot microgreen section. Previously, there was a requirement to submit water tests twice a year to the certifier. That's now been changed because to a note where it says that, you know, a water monitoring program should be in place. And the reason why we did that is 2 tests a year can't guarantee anything to anybody in terms of food safety requirements. And also the organic standard is not a food safety program. So why were we putting the burden on certifiers to assess potability of water for a program that needs to monitor its water and its crops that it's harvesting all the time? So that's the major changes done in that section. And I think that's it for that section, Caroline.
Great. So now we have the permitted substances list for crop, and that's with Simon. Simon, can you speak up?
Sure.
We can hear you.
If I use this mic, am I going to be Joel?
Yeah, maybe turn the camera a little bit to Simon. So Joel, can you turn your camera, or is it possible? Simon, just say something quickly. Hello, Simon, are you there? Uh-oh. Okay, we've lost audio.
Right.
Oh, that
Hello?
that looks like it's working better. Thank you.
Now it's working?
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe we were not muted that whole time.
No, I had it muted.
Okay. Okay, you guys can see me? Okay, ready to go? This should be an easy one, crop production. There are not a lot of big changes. I mean, there are some changes that look big, but there's not a lot of change in terms of content. We can go to the first slide. Yeah, the biggest changes are administrative. The most noticeable one is, whereas currently there are 2 different tables for permitted substances in crop production. There's table 4.2, which is soil amendments and crop nutrition. 4.3 is crop production aids, kind of essentially fertilizers and potting mix and stuff is in 2, and then pesticides and yeah, crop production aids are in 4.3. A lot of the substances were in both tables, and to reduce the size of the list, they just made 1 table with 2 columns, one for soil amendments and one for crop production aids. The other administrative change was there was a directive to try and reduce use of the word non-synthetic, as they thought it was difficult to interpret. And so generally now they're just referring to substances listed in table 4.2. Next slide. So in terms of clarifying the standard, currently there are fertilizers made from microbial biomass. It could be yeast or bacteria. I mean, there's one in particular that's made of bacteria. Those are being allowed, and there is a proposal to, or some felt that they weren't currently allowed, and there was a proposal not to allow them, and that proposal was rejected by the working group. So the status quo remains that microbial products can be used as fertilizers. I think that's all I need to say on that. So this was maybe one of the more controversial ones, was struvite. So there was a proposal to add struvite, which is a mineral fertilizer, a phosphate fertilizer, which can be precipitated out of wastewater streams that have phosphorus in them. And the main one on the market is precipitated out of wastewater from a sewage treatment plant. And so it's like a white crystalline powder that comes out, and that's being marketed. And so the proponents of this were arguing that this is, one, keeps phosphorus out of our waterways where they cause algae blooms in Lake Erie, and 2, it displaces mined phosphorus, which is a non-renewable resource, probably the first nutrient we're going to run out of. And then the opponents believed that there would be risk of contamination of organic land through the use of such products. So the compromise adopted was to allow struvite, but not if it's from sewage. So in theory, you could make struvite from manure, livestock manure. And since you can put that manure straight on your farm, why not allow struvite? So that was that. And then there was a minor change, I would say, to the seaweed extract. Now currently you can make a seaweed extract with hydroxide, sodium or potassium hydroxide. Some people want to make it without those chemicals, just with water, but when you do that, it doesn't keep, it ferments in its bottle. So they wanted a preservative, and the working group voted to allow preservatives for water extracts. That's it, I think. Next slide. Change, I would say kind of minor. Previously, the listing for micronutrients was undefined, and so there was some disagreement as to whether a nutrient was a micronutrient or not, and even the scientific literature is divided in often cases. So now there's this positive list. So if you're a farmer and you're using a synthetic micronutrient that's not on that list, then now's the time to comment. Probably the most, the one for which it was most ambiguous was silicon. And now it has been clarified that silicon is a micronutrient according to the Canadian Organic Standard, and synthetic silicates, which were previously only allowed for tree fruit and fiber processing, that was just a direct cut and paste from the NOP. Now you can use those synthetic silicates as fertilizers, or you will be able to if this standard is adopted. Okay, yeah, that's it. That's easy.
Simon, do you want to speak to any livestock input changes now or later?
Sure, I could do it now.
Okay.
I think that's maybe more significant. Yeah. But there's no slide, eh? There weren't slides from.
No, sorry. So maybe we'll come back to you so that you can think about it.
All right, sure.
Okay. Okay, Rochelle, it's back to you on preparation updates.
Okay. I think I'm on. Yeah, I'm unmuted. Okay, so Carolyn, want to advance the slide? Duplicating sort of what Simon said, we replaced synthetic and non-synthetic through the standard as best as we could. The logic, to give more of it than what Simon actually said, is in the earlier versions of the standard, the word was natural. We used to say natural minerals or natural whatever. And then in one of the versions, we moved to synthetic, non-synthetic, because there's no definition for natural. And then we ran into this problem of assessing what is synthetic and non-synthetic, and therefore we've changed this revision and tried to eliminate the number, how much stress it's been for everybody trying to figure out if the substance they're using was synthetic or not. And the best example we came up with to show how crazy making this was, soap made from animal products or plant products, actually when we assessed it to the standard, to the definition in the standard for synthetic, always would end up being synthetic. So if the soap is really made from animal or plant material, why were we technically ending up with it being synthetic? This way, if we just say it's made from plant, you must use a soap that's made from animal or vegetable oils, we eliminate the confusion on the synthetic, non-synthetic pathway. And so this is going to be a major change for everybody. There might be errors. There's a decision tree to help do the assessment. Hopefully we've gotten it right. We don't know. We're going to be going through a trial and error, but I think most of the certifiers spent quite a bit of time considering this change, and hopefully we've specified clearly enough on what the requirement is. So that's one of the major changes, and it's throughout the entire standard, every section. Next, Caroline. Oh yeah, so here's some examples just to give you. So Simon, oh no, this is over in 6.3. So this is in the processing section. So yeah, you can see the strike through For potassium chloride, it used to say non-synthetic sources. Okay, so that meant you had to go through and make a decision on if the supply was non-synthetic. Now it just says it's got to be from mined sources, and it gives some examples. And it's not a limited list. So if you find something else that's a mined source, it will satisfy that potassium chloride requirement. Another example is in 7.3, which is the cleaning section. We've added essential oils. And up to now, you haven't been able to use an essential oil for cleaning because it wasn't listed in 7.3, because most essential oils that were available to all of us in the marketplace would have fallen into the synthetic category if you did a complete assessment. So by wording the annotation as derived from plant sources and substances in table 6.3, and it just gives all the references to the extraction solvents listing and the carriers, that tells you what will be allowed an essential oil that can be used for cleaning. That one's going to be a little hard to fiddle around with because of the extraction solvent requirements, but at least there's a listing now, and you could actually use an orange oil if it actually meets these criteria. So I don't think there's going to be any major changes in farming practices in most things. I think it's just going to streamline the certification process, and same in across processing too. Next slide, please. Yes, I don't know if I want to talk about this. The non-organic ingredient evaluation. We had a very big boondoggle impact when you were trying to assess non-organic ingredients before, because up to this revision, every component that was contained within a non-organic ingredient, so that was in your less than 5% or your less than 25% in the 70 to 95 category, every component had to be on the PSL. That's basically what the previous text said. This new version in 9.12, where you can see the strike-through changes, is we're saying if the component in the non-organic ingredient doesn't have a technical effect on the product you're making, you don't have to assess it for compliance. That's what that big mess says there. And hopefully we got it worded correctly. Onwards. Okay, so then the other place where I spent too much of my life this last year was talking about water in products. And this was complicated, and when does the water in a product, when does it qualify for organic and when it doesn't? So here are the two examples, and I have to thank Simon for a lot of his contribution in doing this work. So when you purchase, like you're making soup and you purchased a base and the base was liquid, a lot of us were doing the math where the water in the base that you bought, you didn't subtract that out. You would just actually count that as organic. So if we look at the example that's on the screen, it's perfect. So let's say you purchased green tea, now 95% organic liquid green tea, and you added a 5% organic, non-organic flavor. That would have qualified if you called that water in the green tea organic, that product would qualify for organic criteria. But if you take out that water in the green tea, so look at the second lines, 95% of that product was water, 1% was the green extract, and there was a 5% non-organic flavor still. That means the product would have only been 94% organic, and therefore, 1% organic, therefore it doesn't qualify for organic status. So by taking out the water in the purchased ingredient, it changes the category or the claim that can be made on the product. In fact, this tea could only have made an ingredient claim. Well, we've now changed the standard, so the math where you subtract out the water is the requirement. That's what's changing. So it means some products that may currently have organic status might lose their organic status when the water is taken out of the equation. Simon, do you want to say anything else about this, or did I?
Yeah, I could say one thing in that currently the math has to be done currently, and no one was questioning that it should be done if the whole process was being done at one site. So like if in the example of the teas there, if a processor was making a bottled drink with 1% green tea powder, 94% water, 5% inorganic flavor, we always would have excluded the water from that calculation, and it would have been 1/6 organic because we excluded the water.
Yeah,
The only time it changes is when the adding of the water was done by the previous person in the processing step. So the previous person made the tea, and then the second person adds the flavor. Now, because of that, water was kind of getting hidden into the organic product in that situation. So it only changes in those cases where you have multiple step processing done by different companies along the chain, which in theory could have been a way that previously people could make non-organic products organic by splitting out the processing steps along the chain. So that's all I have to say.
And you're very right. And processing has changed very much in Canada over 20 years. A lot of times, like 20 years ago, you would have seen people buy the green tea extract and add the water. Now, a lot of companies do buy prepared ingredients and do the final preparation. So we see a lot more two-step operations. So yeah, that's why we did this. And I think that's the end of that series of slides. Can you just check for me, please, Caroline?
Yeah, it looks like it's the end.
Okay, those are only 2 changes in processing, but they're biggies.
Yeah. Okay, so Simon, I wanted to give you a chance to speak to the livestock inputs, if you have a chance.
Yep. I'm muted again. How about now? Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
So I think what I would like to point out in the livestock PSL are maybe the things that haven't changed. Not much has changed, even though there were some pretty dramatic proposals for change. So maybe if I was going to draw attention to anything, I would bring up the issue of vaccines. So there have been no changes proposed to the listing for vaccine, which is actually under B for biologics, including vaccines. And I don't know, maybe we could get insight from Hugh or someone else on this. There was a lot of talk about it, and the Standards Interpretation Committee asked the technical committee for clarification on vaccines. And my impression is that each of the working groups tasked in which that came up kind of thought that a different working group was covering it. So like the livestock PSL group, the issue with vaccines is predominantly about use of GMOs in making vaccines. So if the production method for a vaccine involves GMOs somewhere in the step, is that vaccine allowed or not? And I think the livestock PSL people thought that the GMO task force was working on it, and the GMO task force maybe thought that the livestock production group was working on it or whatever. And as far as I can see, it has not been addressed. So the issue, I mean, there's one vaccine in particular for pigs for which there are no, what was addressed? Yeah.
The one that.
Where is it addressed? Yeah.
Didn't allow the vaccine that is for the.
Oh, not the castration one. No, the porcine circovirus vaccine. So there's, from what the industry telling us, there are all of the vaccines for this particular virus involve GMOs somewhere in their production. And what's happening now is that certifiers supposedly are not allowing it. And the pigs are just getting sick. And at least that's what we're hearing from the industry. So yeah, I would hope that there will be comments on that and that will at least be clarified. I remember those meetings, and I don't remember the technical committee making a clear decision on those vaccines, whether they should or shouldn't be allowed. Either way, I think it should be clarified in the standard, so it's no longer a standards interpretation committee question. The other related thing would be amino acids. There's a lot of talk about amino acids at the working group and non-organic feed. And from my recollection, the working group on livestock recommended continuing to allow amino acids, synthetic amino acids, maybe even allowing them more liberally, and allowing a certain amount of non-organic feed in the ration. And that proposal, I think, was rejected, but it seems like the end result is that there are no changes either to amino acids or to non-organic feed. And particularly the question of whether or not an amino acid is GMO has also not been clarified. So I would encourage members to comment on that and request clarification from the technical committee on GMO in the production of vaccines, even antibiotics, and amino acids. I think I'll leave it at that.
Simon, it's Hugh. As I read it, we look at vaccines, it says see table 5.3 biologics. When you look at biologics, there's no comment at all, which basically means that all vaccines are allowed.
Hugh, it's funny, you could read it that way, but don't forget 1.4 is overarching over the whole thing, so you do end up in a bad loop.
I mean, that's the way the standard's written now, and the Standards Interpretation Committee believes that the vaccines from GMOs are not allowed. So the current status is GMO vaccines are not allowed, and that's according to the Standards Interpretation Committee. So unless we change something in the standard, they will continue to be not allowed. So there were changes, there was quite a lot of changes to the definitions of GMOs, and you could maybe argue that those changes would affect how you classify vaccines, but it's very interpretive, I think.
Okay, so I mean, this is where we get to witness a little bit of the back and forth. Unfortunately, Francois Labelle wasn't able to join us, but was there any other comments from the GMO side of things, the GMO definition, that anyone wanted to touch on before we turn it over to Nicole to talk about next steps?
I do think it is worth noting that the GMO definition was changed, and it provided further clarification that CRISPR is considered GMO, which I think was one of the major questions that needed to be addressed. So that's probably the biggest clarification from my perspective anyway.
So CRISPR being a newer technology,
it's also known as gene editing.
It's a gene editing, so they're not actually adding new genetic material to the organism, but they're basically going in and editing the existing genome by deleting genetic sequences or that type of thing.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. So Nicole, do you want to speak briefly to the next steps for the technical committee and the OFC, and what's going to happen for reviews going forward? Nicole Boudreau, I will make sure that you are unmuted. Okay, here we go. Now you're unmuted. Oh.
Okay, do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, next steps, we are completing now the public comment. It is a 90-day public comment. It is very long. Usually in the CGSB Manual of Procedures, it was supposed to be 60, but because in the summer producers are so busy, so there is still more 13 days before you submit your comments. So far, I've received one batch of comments, and there were not so many. So I think producers, as we all do, we will receive all of them in the coming days. All the comments have to be analyzed. Negative comments will have to be resolved. And when we receive a comment that has already been considered by the working group, well, we don't need necessarily to revise the proposed modification to the standard. But if we really hear something that was never considered, then we may have to go back to at the working group level and before going to the ballot. I hope that won't be so, because the working groups have been very active. We've had 85 conference calls with the working groups. We had many participants. It was very active, very passionate. We're very happy with the participation, and also with the quality of the chairs of Hugh and all the chairs of the working group. And we are very grateful for the working group participants. After the public comment is over, negative votes, comments are resolved, there will be a ballot. The voting members of the technical committee are listed on the standards. So it is a private ballot that goes at each voter's member. So it's not an open vote. So the ballot usually lasts 30 days. And after that, again, negative votes will have to be addressed and resolved. After the ballot, if we get a positive vote, then we will, it goes to CGSB, who will revise the editorial, who will also have this stamped by the National Council of Canada, excuse me. And it is another step, because CGSB is accredited by the National Council of Canada. So National Council of Canada will revise the will check if all the procedures were respected under the review process before applying their stamp, and then we will be able to. It will be published. It has to be published by November 2020. Just a few words about the funding. We've been very lucky. We had full funding from Agriculture Canada. Agriculture Canada, when they fund the project, we need matching funds from industry, but exceptionally, Agriculture Canada accepted that the matching contribution would be from the in-kind from the working group participants, and also expenses from, for example, by the voting members who would travel to March in Ottawa to participate to the meeting of the technical committee. So we didn't have to take so much cash out of our pocket. But some did through their participation, but there was no extra cash to pay all the other expenses. But we always hear the same. Agriculture Canada tells us it is the last time they will fund the review of the standard, and they have asked us to study some potential funding mechanism for the future revisions. Anyway, we still have many years to think about this. The problem is that the growers consider the standards as a public good, so they always say that it should be funded by the government. The government says no, it is an industry standard that should be covered, and the review should be covered by the industry. It is not resolved. We will still have to work a lot on this. But so far, we are satisfied with the review, with the participation level, and we hope to get many comments because we need good standards to have a credible industry and to maintain equivalence agreements. That's all.
Nicole, sorry, can you just specify the due date, and put the link for where people can make comments directly to OFC in the chat?
If you go on the front page of OFC website, you will see on the news that let me check simultaneously with you all. It is organicfederation.ca, and you can read the public review has now started. So it is under the subtitle of particular interest. So you have copies of the proposed modifications on with track changes, so you can it is what we saw when today's speakers of the webinar were presenting some clauses. You can see that new proposals, new clauses are underlined, and what we want to remove is strike through. So on the WEPC website, under the public review has now started, you have a version with track changes and a clean version that allows you to see what the standard would look like if all the proposed modifications were accepted. And you can also download there the comment, the template that CGSB is asking all commenters to use. So you have to download the form, you have to write your comment, you have to explain your comment. CGSB will not consider comments that are just, I don't know, whining or I don't like this. You have to comment, you have to explain why, and it is always better to propose what you would like to see. So all comments are considered. We give a lot of attention to all the comments because the objective is to have a standard that is clear and that respects it is based on organic principles. Mm-hmm. So you have the information on the WEPC website. On the WEPC website also there is a menu under the green leaves. You can read Standards Review 2020. If you click there, you will see many articles that we could produce under just to as the review was underway. We hired a writer, Janet Wallace from New Brunswick, and you can see you can have more details about the review. You have the articles, for example, about the question of light. The artificial lighting in greenhouses was a hot topic. There was a blog about parallel production. We also had an article about fresh air for organic poultry. Outdoor access for poultry is always another hot topic. The use of some synthetic substances in organic production. So you have many articles. If it is difficult for you to make your decision or to write your comment, you can go back and read some of the articles to help you understand all the arguments, the pros and the cons.
Okay, thanks, Nicole. And I'll just remind everybody as well that the Organic Council of Ontario is represented by Simon Jack, who's on our board. He's also on the board of the Organic Federation of Canada, but he holds the voting rights for OCO at the technical committee. So part of the reason why OCO is holding this webinar and why we want to hear your comments is not only will those comments be processed by the Nicole and the whole process there, but if you send them to OCO, that will give us a sense of what our members think of the different proposals. So I've included in the chat, you can send your comments to standards@organiccouncil.ca. We've also got links to OFC's website and all of the changes in our website. I'll send that to people after the webinar. But also we are intending to send a quick short survey to find out what people think on the major changes. So now is a time for people to offer up any questions that they want answered by the experts on the webinar today. I saw that there was a question in the chat that I'll just repeat for everybody and allow, I think it's David Kohlmeyer who asked the question, who's also on the OCO board. And he asks, I have a question regarding sodium not being a micronutrient. I feel it is needed for assuring quality in some crops. David, if you wanted to speak more to that, you're welcome to actually unmute yourself. I can unmute you too. I'll unmute you now in case you want to say something. Did you want to say anything more about that?
Yeah, I've always thought that sodium was actually an important mineral or element to have in the soil. It's usually there and there's usually enough, but certain crops, especially marshland derived crops like asparagus or celery need it. And if it's not above 0.5% sodium, you've got, you'll have insect problems, and certainly the crop doesn't taste as good. So I want to use sodium as an amendment if it's needed.
Okay, great. And Simon, it looks like you had a response to that.
Yeah. Am I talking now? Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, I meant to send that answer out publicly. It looks like it went just to you. I'm just pointing out that the micronutrient listing is only there to allow for synthetic micronutrients. So sort of the blanket rule in the standard is that synthetic fertilizers are not allowed. This listing makes an exception for synthetic micronutrients because they're all synthetic, like zinc sulfate, boron supplements. Non-synthetic fertilizers that contain sodium would still be allowed regardless of whether sodium is listed as a micronutrient. So you could, non-synthetic sodium chloride mined table salt would in theory be allowed as a mined mineral without, so you could still use non-synthetic sodium fertilizers.
Oh, okay.
I don't see any questions coming up, but I have a question. Joel, forgive me, I was doing a bunch of different things, so I might have missed it. But I'm wondering if you spoke to the winter gardens question for poultry?
I did mention winter gardens. I didn't see a question specifically about winter gardens.
So my specific question about winter gardens is, are there any restrictions on when they can be used? And what is the definition of it? And maybe you can't answer that right away, but we had a webinar, just for context, everybody, we had a webinar earlier on outdoor access for poultry. And one of the suggestions was allowing poultry to, if the weather conditions weren't amenable, or maybe the grounds were not, that poultry could have access to winter gardens, which are more like a covered space, outdoor space. Although, yeah, there's some stipulations on that. And I just wondered if Joel might be able to speak to it a bit more.
So there is a definition of winter garden being added to the standard. So it's saying winter garden is a covered, uninsulated, unheated extension to a poultry barn. It has an outdoor climate, but offers protection from inclement weather, wind, rain, etc., rodents, predators, disease threats. Birds have access to the winter garden year-round during daylight hours, at least from spring through fall. A winter garden has natural lighting, but can be supplemented with artificial lighting, a sand or dirt floor or solid floor covered with bedding, such as straw or wood shavings, for comfort and warmth, and to encourage foraging, scratching, and dust bathing behaviors. Enrichments, example including perches, trays of greens, hay bales, pecking objects, to encourage natural behaviors. So that is what we've included as the definition of a winter garden. And then there are specifications as to the size of winter garden, and if new construction is required, when it is required by, as well as an allowance for existing barns that already show at least 25% of the birds utilizing range, if they can prove that they have at least 25% of their birds using range, even without the winter garden, then they can be exempt from the requirement to build a winter garden.
Okay. There's another question here about whether or not this recording or PowerPoint will be shared. And yes, we are recording this and we'll be sharing it as soon as possible with the participants. It will also be shared publicly in a little bit more time, so you'll get the updated, the fastest access to it. Jolene has a question. Jolene, I'm happy to unmute you if you would like, so you can ask it. But if you would prefer me to ask it, I'll go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to clarify for the changes to the livestock water test requirement standards. So is there going to still be an initial water test required for livestock toxins or any kind of annual testing? And I'm also just curious if anyone can go into what some of the industry standards are. I know that they change and they might vary from province to province, but if anyone can speak to that, I would be interested to hear.
Okay, so the requirement is that livestock of all ages shall have access to clean, fresh water on demand. Livestock water sources shall be tested according to livestock drinking water quality guidelines and procedures outlined in the relevant code of practice. So the codes of practice are federal, so they're not variable by province. So in terms of inspection and like certifiers, we can apply those federal codes of practice by species. We don't have to divide those up by province as well. And so, yeah, so there isn't a specific requirement for initial analysis for livestock toxins, because getting a definition is like, we don't know as certifiers what that means in terms of what kind of a water test, what toxins, what time of year. Like it gets into which water sources need to be tested at what point at the source, like is it at the well or is it at the outlet where the actual livestock are drinking, how many samples need to be taken, all that kind of stuff. But that is all laid out in each of the codes of practice. And so we just thought that the best way to do it was to refer back to those codes of practice and say, by species, check your code of practice, and do what they say.
Nicole, are you trying to speak? We can't hear you. There's something not connecting. I think it's maybe your earphones. Nicole, we thought, yeah, go ahead, try again.
So
we can hear you now.
Okay, sorry, I was on another call. Can you repeat the question, please? I'm sorry.
Oh no, we saw you speaking. I thought you were trying to say something. Okay, all right.
No, but I'm just like, sorry to interrupt. Excuse me, I thought I was on mute. About the vaccines in organic production, I'm checking in 5.1.1 for 5.1.2, 5.1.3, because I understood it would be allowed to use G vaccines, but I'm checking, so
okay,
I'm surprised.
I'll come back to you.
Nicole, it's Michelle. I sent you, Hugh, and Simon some information. I did the research. There is a proposal. Somehow the information didn't get transferred into the final document. So check your email. It's there. Okay.
Okay.
Great. Well, and that I have another follow-up question on that, which is if somebody, you're saying that there will be follow-up on any negative comments that come up in the next couple of weeks. Under what circumstances will changes be made before the vote based on the comments that are received? Nicole?
Yes, I was reading Rochelle's email. Can you I am caught as a bad student. Can you repeat, please?
I said, Nicole, so under what circumstances, if a negative comment is received on the standards that has some clear rationale, under what circumstances will the standards be changed before the next CGSB vote or technical committee vote?
Oh, okay, when we will receive all the comments, first of all, they will be shared with all the chairs of the working groups. And as I said, if the comment was already considered, we have all the minutes and all the working group meetings were recorded. And so we had a good secretary taking care of this. So if a comment was already considered, we may just, recognize that the comment, but it won't it wouldn't change the proposed modification that would be balloted. If the comment was never considered, and it is really something new that we hear that the working group, missed, then we may have to go back to the working group with the chair to have a working group meeting and to propose something else. We never had to do that. We didn't have to do that in the review of 2015. But if we have to do so, go back to the working group, have the working group considering this new comment that was never considered. It is something we have to do because we have to be transparent and we have to consider all the comments.
Okay, thank you very much. I see there's another question from Magdalena. I will make sure that you are unmuted in case you want to ask it yourself. There you go. Oops, I hope I didn't. Did I just mute you by accident? Here we go. Yes, you're unmuted, Magdalena. Did you want to ask the question?
Great. Thanks, Caroline. Yeah, no, hopefully you can hear me. Like I say, I'm looking for information. I wonder if there's going to be any updates or changes regarding natural health products under the core or even novel foods. So, for example, if I use a European manufacturer and it's certified in Europe, certified organic in Europe, but when I want to bring it into Canada, I'm having problems, obviously, as it's currently out of scope of the core because here it's considered a natural health product, whereas in the States, the National Organic Program is covering dietary supplements. Is there any plan, or how is the future of that looking in Canada? As currently there seems to be no plan for me to get organic certification for my natural health product. Anyone have any insight into that, please?
So I'll maybe turn it over to Simon or Rochelle, but first I want to say that I think the real question is, in what case does the changes to the standard help with the scope of the core? Because the core is a regulatory, we're working under the Safe Food for Canadians regulations, which is a regulatory issue, and that is a real question of how do we change that, and that would probably be a question for advocacy at the national level and the Canada Organic Trade Association. I know that there's interest there, but is there any flexibility within the standards to do something like this? That's my question for Rochelle or Simon.
I can propose an answer.
First, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think Catherine pretty much answered it, that the standard as it's written, I think, could easily be applied to natural health products, but it's not an issue that, unfortunately, that issue of what's covered by the standard isn't democratic in the way that the writing of the standard is. It's really just the CFIA and the government and Health Canada together would have to decide what they would allow us to certify. There's a few options, like Health Canada could create its own regulation completely separate from the Safe Food for Canadians Act that allows for this same standard to be applied to the products that they regulate, or you could try and expand the scope of the existing regulations. There's a few ways that could be done, but I mean, as it stands, a private company could, in theory, offer a private, unregulated certification to the Canadian Organic Standard.
Simon, maybe you can help clarify though, so at what point is a natural health product considered a health product versus a food product? So if it's, so the question is a novel food approval, for example. So I guess the question is about marketing to some degree, but when a product or health product is made of all food products or agriculturally derived products, can it not be then sold under the core?
It comes down to it comes down to how is the product being marketed, and like in Canada, the NPN registration process, if it's registered as an NPN, it's a registered health product, natural health product, and therefore is being marketed as a health product, and therefore is outside of the scope of the core. So, yeah.
And as we've seen with the aquaculture you know, there are two, with, I guess with aquaculture they had to create their own standards, but they could have been created under the organic standards because fish is under. Can someone answer that? How come fish is considered okay under the core, or was that was a standards change versus a regulatory change?
It's food.
It's fine. Yeah. Okay. So that's
Okay.
fine. Gotcha.
So that's the key point. We are under a Food Act, food regulation. So food, feed, and seed is covered. Anything that doesn't qualify in those categories based on claim, based on composition, based on other regulations. Again, cannabis edibles will not be able to be certified under our standard because we're food, and edibles is its own category of product under Health Canada.
Right.
So it's the navigation at the regulatory level where we haven't expended enough energy as a sector trying to resolve these differences between the government silos.
Okay, and I'm seeing that it's now at 1:40. Were there any other burning questions before we cut this off? You can always send your questions, follow-up questions to me. I will happily make sure that those are answered. And
Carolyn, can you
yes,
go over
ahead.
again the posting of the slide deck on the OCO website?
Yes. So first of all, we'll send the recording to all of the participants within the week, and then we'll be posting that publicly before the comment period is over. But I'll be sure to be following up with an email to everyone. And yeah, like I said earlier, if you'd like to send comments regarding the changes to the standards to standards@organiccouncil.ca or to Carolyn@organiccouncil.ca, we'll take those into consideration when going to the vote as well.
I'll just add quickly one more thing on that issue of natural health products. Maybe we're dismissing the possibility of having that regulated too easily, in that the Safe Food for Canadian regulation is indeed a regulation under an act that only covers food, but they basically wrote in a reference to two completely different acts in order to have the organic standard cover things which are not covered under the Safe Food for Canadians Act. So to get livestock feed included, the regulation references the Feeds Act. And then to get seed included, they had to make the regulation reference the Seeds Act. So I think there's a possibility, even with the regulations being under SFCR, to have other things regulated under it and become certifiable.
Absolutely, Simon. But the fact is CFIA won't go out and do that collegial outreach to make it happen. It's Health Canada has to actually approach CFIA and say, oh, we want this resolved. And because there are two silos, it ain't happening. Okay?
But it definitely will require some push from industry to make it happen.
Yeah,
so that's
absolutely.
Yeah, I think that was my question.
Yeah.
If there was any like murmurs or if there was any talk of that already happening or not.
There has been at the national level.
Okay.
Yeah. CODA has mentioned it a couple of times. I'm not sure that the supplements were among the priorities of there's beauty products.
It is a priority. It's been mentioned many times, broadening the scope of the regulation. And because we've had so many things going on, we just haven't done a coordinated explanation of we've actually rationalized all the reasons why it should be changed. We've done those presentations. I know Cole has done that work. I know lots of people have done this work. And so far it's been on deaf ears. So maybe once we get past the standards review and we're past our funding formulation issues, things, we just have to get coordinated again and put in some effort. So Magdalena, get ready. You might need to make some presentations.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Now we know that you want it type of thing.
Yeah. Okay, and I'll just mention quickly that in Ontario, we have a private members bill to help regulate at the provincial level. That at this point hasn't moved much, but we did have a fairly open definition for products under that. in the case that it was, if it went through, that we would have a window of opportunity in Ontario to push something that might be then adopted at the federal level. But likely the likelihood of that all happening is fairly slim at this point. Okay, so thank you all so much for joining us, and I really appreciate everybody's time. It's amazing to have all of these folks who have been so involved in the process be here online. And again, if you have any questions, please do follow up. Thank you, everybody, and have a great day.
And thank you, Caroline, for organizing that.
Okay, take care, everyone.
Okay. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.